Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Uh, in the course on gender and social work, today we have the module on post-colonial feminism. I am Vandana Sonarkar, retired professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I was in women's studies. In this module, what we will try and do is understand what post-colonial feminism is, but for that we would have to locate it within different streams of feminism, as well as understanding something of what post-colonial theory is, which not all of you might be that familiar with. I would presume that you are familiar with the different streams of feminism. So post-colonial feminism is chronologically located in relation to these. First of all, we have liberal feminism, which comes with the liberal ideas of the 19th century, after the French Revolution really. But liberal feminism has an existence right from Mary Wollstonecraft onwards at the end of the 18th century. And there is a liberal feminist stream which continues, which asks for similar rights for women as are granted to men. Radical feminism, which can be traced back to the 1960s in Western Europe and the US, goes much more to the root of the matter, as the word radical implies, and talks about sexual differences between men and women as being basic to the antagonism between them. And even socialist feminism, which goes beyond liberal feminism and believes that the aims and objectives of feminism can't really be achieved within a bourgeois democratic framework. All of these three streams can be said to emerge from the liberal democratic revolutions of Europe. Of course, radical feminism, socialist feminism are also important parts of the second wave of the 1960s and 70s. And Marxist feminism, which had a certain existence in the Russian Revolution of 1917 as well. We have figures like Alexandra Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, who raised fundamental questions to the leaders of the revolution. So when we see these different streams, post-colonial feminism really emerges in the 1980s. Okay, one of the other streams which emerges at this time is black feminism in the US, well, after certain writings in post-colonial theory begin to come out at the end of the 70s, we have feminist reactions to them as well. So we can think of post-colonial feminism as a critique of two trends really. It opposes mainstream feminism, which is basically the production of white Western women, okay? White women in Western Europe and the US. And black women are also beginning to speak out against this. But Western women, because now we also have in many of what are called third world countries, feminist organizations, feminist writing, feminist scholarship coming out from the 70s onwards. So a critique of this mainstream feminism. On the other hand, it also takes issue with the body of postcolonial theory. We have very powerful writings of someone like Edward Said, who looks at the kind of academic scholarship and historiography about the former colonies by scholars in the imperialist countries as being a project really to prop up the force of imperialism and act as a part of justifying governance by foreign rulers. However, Edward Said is not very sensitive to the gender aspects. And so post-colonial theory steps in here and brings out the gender aspects. So we are talking about two different types of critique. Let us first look at the critique of mainstream Western feminism and the kind of canonical figure here is Chandra Tarpade Mohanty. In 1984, she publishes Under Western Eyes. She criticizes Western writings about women in the third world that construct something called the third world woman as a monolithic subject. And most importantly, Western women forget their privileged position, and not just a privileged position which blinds them to the realities of what third world women live through, but they also forget their powerful position in the world of academia, so that what they say has outcomes. What they say has influence through international funding agencies, international development agencies, even on the policies of governments of formerly colonized countries. So forgetting your position of privilege, which biases your understanding, and forgetting your position of power, which creates an impact from what you write. These are the two blind spots. To sum up Mohanty in a little more detail, all feminism engages in the critique of patriarchy. Patriarchy is something which we find all over the world in different societies, in different periods of history. But yet patriarchy doesn't operate in the same way at all times and in all locations, in all sections of society. So seeing women, even women of the so-called third world, as a monolithic group, blunts the edge of critiques of patriarchy and ultimately even how you understand patriarchy in your own society. So that is one very important point that Mohanty makes. Secondly, when we say that women are oppressed all over the world, that patriarchy is something common to women, to societies in all countries, to talk about the universality of women's oppression can be a little misleading also. Because the kind of examples that you pick to illustrate this can sometimes be misleading. And we really have to understand patriarchy in its own location, how it uses economic power, how it uses culture, how it uses control over sexuality, the ways in which these are done, the kind of discourses which back up patriarchal power are different everywhere. The third and perhaps the most important point is that third world women are somewhere typecast as being ignorant, more heeding traditional kind of constraints because they are ignorant, because they have not been educated. And on the other hand, it is Western women who have been real feminists, who have rebelled against this. And therefore, it is their task to educate and enlighten the women of the third world. So this again is a misrepresentation. It's worth reading Mohanty in more detail, but let us turn to Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who comes out with an important critique of post-colonial theory from the point of view of a feminist. Okay. And again, there's a classic article called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" As you know, the word subaltern has been used by the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci to denote different sections of society who are marginalized and oppressed, not just by class, but by other kind of structures as well. And so the word subaltern is more inclusive than the word, proletariat, which Marx uses to denote the working class. Subaltern, the word was then used by scholars like Partha Chatterjee, like Ranjit Guha, who started a series called Subaltern Studies. What Gayatri Spivak says is that, referring to something like what Edward Said is saying, really, of course, she agrees that imperialism carries out what can be called epistemic violence by undertaking the remotely orchestrated, far-flung and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. I'm quoting from her here. The construction of the colonial subject as other, which is done through heterogeneous means, but is an all-encompassing kind of project, orchestrated, far-flung. Okay, and these are the words she uses. And postcolonialism attempts to restore that other, to rewrite history from the point of view of the other, from the point of view of what you may call the people. Okay. But then Spivak asks another question. Who are these people that we are talking about? Again, a slightly longish quote from Spivak. Within the effaced itinerary of the subaltern subject, the track of sexual difference is doubly effaced. Okay. So, as I said, subalternity is something which encompasses different kinds of structures in society which marginalize certain sections. Not just class, but somehow sexual difference does not come into the writings of many of them. So, sexual difference is effaced both as object of colonial historiography and as subject of insurgency. So, the women in the involved in the rebellions of the colonized subject, the women involved in various kinds of uprisings, do not really come into the picture. So they do not come into the picture either as a matter of historiographical record or as agents of change, agents of resistance. The ideological construction of gender keeps the male dominant. If in the context of colonial production the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more in shadow. That is what Gayatri Spivak says. And then she talks about what she calls the paradox of representation of the voiceless. And she talks about white men saving brown women from brown men. This is something in relation to the problem of sati, which became a topic very much debated in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the British colonialists were shocked by the idea of a woman burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre. And so this was a kind of atrocity which was being inflicted on the brown women by the brown men. But on the other hand, we also have an Indian nativist ideology which talks about the woman really wanting to die, that it is an expression of her love and her faithfulness to her husband, which the foreigners do not understand. What Spivak says is that both of these actually exclude the voice of the woman herself and somewhere don't see her agency. And this can happen in many different contexts actually. Even when we have now Dalit women who have suddenly become the subject of a lot of academic study, upper caste women trying to bring Dalit women into an agenda where they were not present before are still talking about them from the outside, in a sense. It's a representation from the outside. And then we should come to the problem of representation, which Spivak has discussed in some detail. And there is a bit of a dilemma here. She points out the difference between two forms of representation. There are two German words, darstellen and vertreten. So the German word darstellen designates the process of representation as depiction. You know, when you are talking about the Dalit women, you are writing about her. You are not a Dalit woman yourself, but you are writing about the Dalit woman. You are depicting her situation. There is another kind of representation, vertreten, which is rhetoric as persuasion. This is something which Marx refers to when he is talking about peasants who are not as conscious of class and of class contradictions as the industrial working class are. And in fact, then they have to be spoken for in some sense. They have to be represented politically. Those who cannot represent themselves must be represented. That is what vertreten means. But they are also occluded by the forms of depiction imposed on them from outside. While speaking for them, while representing them politically, you picture them in a particular way, which is again something which is being done from the outside. This is a dilemma which faces us. The next thing we have to come to when we are talking about post-colonial feminism, and there is quite a body of writing now which can be said to fall within this tradition. There is historiography where the history of colonial countries is being written not just by post-colonial male theorists but by feminists. Even the subaltern studies collection does have a few Gayatri Spivak herself has contributed. Ranjit Guha has written. I mean, there are even male writers who have, on occasion, written from this point of view. But post-colonial feminism has to pay attention to oral sources because a lot of women's history has not ever been written down. It has, however, in some way been passed on by word of mouth. So interviewing women of an earlier generation when they are still alive can be one way of doing this. And an example of this is in Marathi, Urmila Pawar and Meenakshi Moon, while writing a history of women's participation in the Ambedkar movement. They wrote this, they published this work in 1989, and during the latter part of the 1980s, they found women who had participated in the Ambedkar movement and interviewed them. So this is one form. Feminist scholarship has taken oral history quite seriously and refined its forms. We find that there are many such sources which are passed on by word of mouth. Sometimes, one example I give is when Sojourner Truth made a speech during the campaign on suffrage, on universal suffrage in the US. As a black woman, she said that she could represent women better than white women. She says, I'm not weak. I don't need male support when I go out, but ain't I a woman anyway? And this ain't I a woman speech and parts of it were taken up and made into posters, during the time of the second wave of the women's movement. And so this is one use of oral history also. A related concept which we talk about is that of the testimonio. This is a Latin American term, again used in the male context, and when a marginalized subject typically writes or speaks about his or her own experiences, and through this throws light on a certain kind of situation which has not been recorded by formal history. So the testimonial becomes, there are such autobiographical accounts, biographical accounts, which are a contribution of Latin American scholarship. So actually we can even read out a definition of the testimonio as a first-person narration of socially significant experiences by a typical or extraordinary witness or protagonist who metonymically represents others who have lived through similar situations. So it's interesting, typical or extraordinary. Metonymical, that means the part representing the whole, that is a figure of speech of that kind, and socially significant experiences. In India, we have had many autobiographies by Dalit writers, especially from the 1980s onwards. Similar kind of things like Alex Haley's Roots in the US, where a black man traces the genealogy of his family right back to his ancestors who were slaves. Postcolonial feminism has been quite active in accessing many such sources, and it is in fact, it has thrown open a rich field of scholarship and research. Today, we have important writers and oral history scholars from Vietnam, different African countries, Latin America, of course. In India, Dalit women writers, women writers from the Northeast, and so these diverse sources are available to post-colonial feminism, and as students also, you should look at them. To just summarize what we have tried to do in this module, first of all, to locate post-colonial feminism as a development which comes during the 1980s in reaction to the fact that all three streams which we usually talk about when we are talking about the streams of feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism, socialist feminism, all trace their roots to Western liberal democratic revolutions. So post-colonial feminism talks about feminism originating in colonized countries. This trend comes from the 1980s onwards, and it critiques two things. It critiques mainstream feminists located in the West who have a stereotypical view of third world women. It also critiques the post-colonial theory and post-colonial histories which were in a way the theory of history which Edward Said talks about, and others of course, and something like the Subaltern Studies project in India, which attempts an alternate historiography. So we have Chandra Mohanty as a major example of the first kind of critique, and Gayatri Spivak as a major proponent of the second type of critique. So, third world women and their voice are thrown into shadow. We want to bring them out, but we remember also that this problem of depiction, of representation, can also do injustice to the people we are talking about. So, an awareness of that kind. There is a kind of self-reflexivity in post-colonial feminism, which is an important component of this stream of thought. And then, of course, the opening up of new sources of history and knowledge by accessing oral histories, by looking at records of one's own life by all kinds of people. So this is what we've tried to talk about. I would have already mentioned some of the important sources, but I would suggest that look at writings by Vietnamese writers. There is a very important writer called Trin. Dalit women writers from India. The history of women in the Ambedkar movement has been translated into English and published as We Also Made History. There are several Latin American scholars now who are writing feminist or using feminist testimonials, women's testimonials for feminist analysis. There are African writers, both writers of fiction as well as historians. There are African American writers. I think rather than mentioning a lot of names, I would suggest look for them. Look for writers from different sources. And then I have mentioned some of the important theorists on this subject. Thank you. This has been a module placed in the course on gender and social work. I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to do this, as well as to the students, and good luck with using this resource. Okay. Thank you.